Hi, this is a presentation of static routing implementation, and it's a part of my CCNA2 course. This is about static routing and why we are using it. Because basically there are two ways to implement routing, either statically or dynamically. If you do it statically, you will manually enter all the routes into your router, and you need to configure it yourself as the administrator. Whereas if you use dynamic routing, the routers themselves will exchange information and find out how to find different routes. We will look now at how to do this manually. And sometimes it is a good idea to do it manually. First of all, because we are in more control. If I enter the route statically myself, well, I decide where and how to send the traffic. Of course, also, it's considered to be more secure because we don't rely on updates coming from other routers. We do it ourselves. Static routes also acquires or uses no bandwidth because you don't send any updates to your neighboring routers, and it doesn't use any CPU to calculate the best path to different routes because you have manually entered that as well. And the path is known. I know when I set up static routing which path the traffic will go. So it's more secure. It's actually difficult to configure because you manually have to do everything. So static routing is good for small networks. It's good for instance, if you only have one way out of your network, well, then it's good because it doesn't use any of the CPU or the bandwidth of the router. If you have large networks, which changes a lot, it will be stupid to use static routing because you have to configure it over and over again. So small networks and networks with a limit number of routes could be a good idea to use static routing. Of course, also if you want to be very secure. So here an example of when to use static routing. If you have something called a stub network. This here is an example of a stub network where you have only one way out of the network. When you are on router 1, well, everything else, you have only one neighbor, and that is router 2 in this case. And whenever you're going to communicate outside your own network, it will be sent to router 2. So in this case here on router 1, it could be a good idea to set up a static route to go to router 2. So we can set up static routes to connect to one specific network. We can do it as something called the gateway of last resort, which is a dynamic route where you set up, no, not dynamic, a default route, where whenever you have something you don't know what to do with, you will send it out this way. If you have something called a summarized route, if you like to do super netting, where you add different networks together, you can also advertise this as a static route, or you can use it when you have a backup route, if you want to have something to take over if the other one fails. So here an example of a static route where you have a stub network. You can, whenever on router 1, if you want to reach this network, or if you are on router 2 and you want to reach the network behind router 1, well, then there is only one way to get there, and it will not change. So in this case, you can set up a static route to 172.16.3.0, which is the route behind router 1. And you can tell this on router 2 as the standard static route for a specific network. A default static route is where you set up whenever I have something here where I have no match, then I will send it out to this route. The static route on IP version 4 is given by 4 zeros. That means all routes, all networks. So this is like the default gateway on a local area network, but here it's on a routed network. So whenever I get something that I don't know anything about, I will send it out to my default route. And this could make sense, for instance, on router 1 here. Whenever I have something that's not my own network, I will send it up to router 2. So then I can make a default route, a default static route to router 2. A summary route, in example here, I have behind router 1. I know there is a lot of different networks, all starting with 172 something something. I can add these networks to a summarized route, and I can advertise that in router 1 and make a static connection to that. Because we want, when we have routing tables, we want them to be as small as possible, to have as a few entries as possible. So instead of having like 5 different networks here, or 4 different in this case, well, I can have 1 entry instead. So we normally also would like to use static static routes for summarized networks. And we can use them for the last one, where to have a backup route. This is called a floating static route. It's something which is something that we configure with a higher administrative distance than the other routing protocols that are used, because it will always look at the one with the lowest administrative distance and will choose the one with the lowest administrative distance. If we make a static route with a higher one, we will make sure that in case the first one goes down, well, then our backup here will take over. So it's a way of configuring a backup route. We can use static routes for that. Yeah, and that was the first part about the static routes.